Oh, there he is. See? How beautiful. You know, if we were really all together, we'd be just like, hey, want some coffee? Would you like some cookies?
I'm ready for my coffee.
Hey, everybody.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Teresa.
Arlene.
Larlene.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Day 80, Margarita.
Woohoo! Man, who starts a new job with the pandemic? Who does that?
Hey, Mark. Hey, Ori.
Hey, can only get better from here.
Moves to a different state and starts a new job.
I guess it's more common than what we think.
The moving company's closed. The furniture store is closed.
Hey,
You know.
Mark.
Congratulations.
Thank you. First world problems. Yeah, should be an interesting next stop on the journey.
Well, we wish you well, Mark.
Thank you. You won't get rid of me so quickly.
No, that's good. We love that accent of yours.
I was just watching the Boston mayor give his speech. That's an accent. Holy cow, that guy's right out of a Mark Wahlberg movie or something. Wow.
So cool.
Mark, are you in your new office?
No, not yet. I don't start till July 1st.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm still in Garrison. I'm in Garrison till June 10th.
Okay, Mark, I'm late, so give me just one brief of what's happening.
So I'm moving to Natick, Massachusetts. I'm going to be, as of July 1st, I'll be the executive director of Temple Shir Tikva in Wayland, Massachusetts.
Nice.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, Alan is with a baby.
Yeah, I found this thing about 8.5 months ago. So
You can leave her on screen and leave. Congratulations.
Yeah.
thank you. This is Ursa.
Oh, what a great name.
I also have my colleague Brandy Augustus who's joining us today.
Oh, hey.
So,
Hey, Brandy. Welcome.
told her all about this group.
And she came anyway.
That's right.
I say we go ahead and get started here. Welcome, everyone, to our weekly community call. We're doing these every week now. We've had maybe 3 or 4 in a row. I am excited to have a guest here today, Mark Piper, who's going to be talking about policies and best practices for policies at retreat centers, obviously a pressing topic for all of us. But I wanted to start with just a couple announcements before we go into that. Mark will talk for a while. We'll do some breakout groups and we'll talk together. And then we'll come back together and talk as a larger group at the end. So there's going to be a lot of time to connect. But there are some new folks here, and I want to make sure that people know a little background about what we're doing. So the Retreat Center collaboration has been around for 1.5 years, almost 2 years. We're an effort of the Fetzer Institute, and we are working to connect and understand retreat centers all across North America. Recently, we've had some calls to us from places that are not North America. I think retreat centers in general are like, how can we reach out and learn from our peers? So this is a perfect time to be having these community calls, and that's why we're doing them weekly now. My role is as coordinator, so I'm here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but other people from the RCC are all across the United States and Canada. And just a couple quick announcements before we get going. One is that we're working on a new project related to resilience, and I'm trying to find folks from our network who are interested in addressing that topic and thinking about how retreat centers might want to start working on resilience for the next major disaster, whether that be economic or climate or pandemic or forest fire, whatever that may be. How can we work together to be more prepared and to find a best practices kind of world for that work? So if you're interested in that, email me. I'll put my email in the chat box. I also want to invite submissions for future call topics. If there's something you've been waiting for us to host and we just haven't brought it up for some reason, let me know what that is so we can find someone to speak on it. If you want to speak on it, let me know that too, and we can try to get more topics. I also wanted to mention the next 2 calls. The next call is going to be our postponement from a previous call that was sort of moved around. We're going to have Teresa Mateus host a call on grief. She is she has a background in grief and trauma. And so her holding of that space and holding of our process as retreat centers going through major shifts was something we were really looking forward to. She wasn't able to host a couple weeks ago, so we've moved it to next week. So we'll have that next week. And then the week following, we won't be having a community call, which is a little strange for us, but we're going to be on retreat. So we will be virtually holding some space, and that space won't allow me to be able to host both things. So no call on June 2nd. But I will have a new calendar of events coming up for the calls in June in the next week or so. I'll be able to announce that. So without further ado, Mark Piper, director of the Cenacle Center, which is in Chicago, a project of the Cenacle sisters. Mark, can you help us know what you're going to talk about here?
Sure. Well, I just want to take us back to that simpler, gentler time known as January 2020, when I signed up to facilitate a call on policies and procedures pre-coronavirus, COVID-19, SARS, any of that. And we're keeping with the thread of the COVID-19 issues and being agile and pivoting. And so you should have received an agenda yesterday, and the original agenda looked a little different, but not entirely different, as it's been finessed to focus on the policies and procedures, internal and external, that may be of most relevance to us at this current time. So what's going to happen is I will go over a little case study just for the Cenacle, for a little chronology of what we've been doing with practices, policies, and procedures. Then I will also, to some extent, briefly go over some highlights of internal policies, and then separately external policies. So we've got some parameters, and it's not just one big amorphous thing. At that point, when you're tired of hearing from me, which should take no more than 20 minutes, if not much sooner than that, we'll go into some breakout rooms so that we could have a discussion that can dive deeper into what we can do in our spaces and places, being agile and pivoting, relating to external policies and internal policies. That'll be approximately 20 minutes. Then we will come back in a large group and share what each of us can do, what we might be facing, what isn't practical, which is very difficult in a time of uncertainty and volatility, but that's the lay of the land. And so, as I said, if you've got the agenda, it's basically 3 points. The first point is a Cenacle case study, a chronology of being agile and pivoting on policies. In early March, we started getting a few phone calls, and obviously we as a staff started taking note of the news and things, but we at the Cenacle primarily are 88-bed facility in Lincoln Park, which is, in effect, it's not the Loop, but downtown Chicago, 5 blocks from what I refer to as our public pool that many people refer to as Lake Michigan. We started getting some phone calls from different participants and group leaders, because again, most of our hosting is outside groups. There's only 4 or 5 events a year that we sponsor or host, and that's usually through the Cenacle sisters. So we primarily are just a host for nonprofits and other entities to have their board meetings and social justice work on site with us. One of the first was a facilitator from Seattle, which before New York became an epicenter, Seattle was the epicenter in the United States with COVID-19. And they're like, well, what do we do with these flights are getting canceled? They're self-quarantining. Are you going to charge us? We've had to book and contract for this number of people. So as this starts piling up, we knew that we would be certainly at a minimum flexible with folks, because again, not only do we host, but we host folks, I wouldn't say primarily, but extensively from outside the state of Illinois, whether they drive in from Indiana or Wisconsin or Kentucky, or fly in from New York, California, or Rome, Italy. So Crystal Chan, and let me just say, anything that you think is good or positive here, I don't work alone, and anything that good or positive comes out of the Cenacles because we have a good team and people like Crystal Chan, whom some of you have met through the Fetzer Institute or other places. And I want to stress her work and help and outlook in all of this. We started developing a policy, not a policy, but what can we do to be mindful? And this is at the early stage before we realize everybody's going to be dealing with this and everyone's going to have heightened stress. So we at the Cenacle, we don't have cancellation policies, but we did have a 90-day room reduction policy, so that within 90 days, you had up to 90 days to reduce the number of folks who were coming, except we still allowed for what we called a 10% attrition rate. So snowstorms, rainstorms, people can't come in, they get the flu, up to 10% of your group we would cancel. What we said in a communication in March, at the middle, well, the second week of March, early second week of March was, if it's the honor system, we value you, we're here to help you and host you. We likely may not be able to do that in the same way because some of you are coming from hotspots. Before this, we realized how big it was. You know, any person in your group who cannot attend for any reason related to COVID-19, they are under self-isolation. Their work says they can't travel out of state. Whatever it is, we trust you. We will go beyond the 10% attrition. If we're still open right now, and if you're still able to come, even if you were originally a group of 30, you show up as 15, that's fine. So that was our first thing, because we wanted to communicate to our guests, because again, those questions and calls kept coming in. Not that we had any answers per se, but we knew that we would have to be flexible because that was who we are and the right thing to do. Then on March 13th, the president declared COVID-19 a national emergency. And we in Chicago had been anticipating the last day or two that the mayor would announce shelter-in-place orders. And she was waiting for the governor to do so, which would happen a few days later. So we decided on March 13th that we would close our doors. I don't remember, it might have just been 2 weeks at the time. And so what we did is, we closed our doors on March 13th. Crystal and I contacted all group leaders through August and said, we know this is an uncertain time. We know what our policies are, but we want to change them so that our strict non-refundable deposits, you would be able to roll over if you so chose to cancel and reschedule your event. We would hold your deposit for up to a year. If your events during when we're closed, and this is all public consumption information, turns out our non-refundable deposit is refundable. So while we would be happy to hold your refund and or convert part of it to a donation, if we're closed while you were supposed to be here, you know, you are eligible for that. So that was our suspension of normal operations in March. COVID-19 keeps growing. The threat to our cousins, what I would call the tourism and hospitality industries, keeps exacerbating. And so here we are, knowing that we too cannot safely host people at this time with social distancing mandates or even having staff on site. So by April, we expanded again our policies and our communication. So instead of just the folks from March to August, it was March to the end of calendar 2020. And we said, all right, as long as we're able, we will, for any and all of you, we will hold your deposits and roll them over for an event for up to 2 years from now. And again, if we are closed, and now we're closed through May 1st, if we're closed during when you were supposed to be with us, we of course would refund your deposit after discussion of perhaps a donation or conversion there. And that's what we kind of stuck with, is having regular communication. We eventually put a COVID-19 update on our website, the latest one from yesterday, because we were going to be closed. We knew at a minimum we would be closed, and we communicated this for as long as Illinois, the governor and or the mayor of Chicago had shelter-in-place mandates. At a very minimum, we were not going to do anything that would abscond from those orders or mandates, which wouldn't mean that the next day we were going to open up. It would mean we're closed for at least that duration, and then we figure out what to do after that. So as Illinois continues to extend its shelter-in-place, we continue to extend our closure, which meant most staff working from home, still getting paid, some of us coming in periodically, and of course directing concerns from folks to the CDC, but also we're looking at the CDC, state guidance, county guidance, city health directives and mandates. And that's where we were at. What helped us in the beginning, one of our policies, which isn't changing, is the Cenacle is an adults-only facility. And I know some folks on this call host high school groups, so spring is a real rough time to be closed. For us, that wasn't so much of an issue because while spring is busy, it's not like summer or fall, but here we are, and we have chosen to be closed through at least July 1, even though we don't know when and how long Illinois' phases of reopening will commence at this point. So that's where we were at. One of our values was communication. We wanted to offer flexibility because everyone is stressed out and everyone is concerned, and we host nonprofit groups who, like us, because retreat centers are generally not cash cows, who are cash strapped, or maybe university groups that all of a sudden they've contracted but they didn't get their deposit in, and that's fine because now there's no discretionary spending for the next 6 months for a lot of organizations. So we take notes, we listen, and we're being as flexible as possible, and that leads us to best practices one, the external policies, which is effectively what I've been talking about, how we've been managing our relationships. For those of us who are owned or sponsored by or somehow are in relation to a religious congregation or order, we like to use the ministerial language and view ourselves as a ministry. Of course, there is always the bottom line, that is business, to keep the doors open. But we value the relationships we have with our guests and visitors. And so again, in this time of volatility and uncertainty, we have what's on paper, the stated policies, but we're making our practices a little more broad in understanding. So again, normally you would have to pay your deposit, which would be 35% to the Cenacle within 30 days of drawing up a contract. We're being somewhat flexible with that and working on a case-by-case basis. Again, the Cenacle doesn't have cancellation fees, so we've been doing this dance of here's how much information we have and when we might open, but we really can't, we don't have the crystal ball. And asking groups over the coming months, where are you at? Are you reducing? Because even when we do open, we probably cannot host groups the way we had planned to over our weekends in the fall, where we might have 150 people in the building. Social distancing, that likely is not going to be possible. We have looked at room reductions, both as a policy. Obviously we're holding to that COVID-19 position that we developed, which is if there is a point where we can safely open and the state says we can welcome 50 people, 100 people, or however many people, so long as we adhere to social distancing, even if you booked at 50 and only 22 of you arrive in this time, that's fine. A few weeks ago on this call, we had a doctor to help give us some perspective. I hate to do this, but here at the Cenacle, we do require certificates of insurance in addition to our signed contracts. Again, because the Cenacle Retreat and Conference Center is not its own entity, we are part of the Cenacle Convent Inc., still owned by the sisters. So it's also talking with the legal world about beyond if the state says it's okay to open, and then beyond our own prudential judgment and policies put in place to keep staff safe and then guests safe, what are the liabilities, even if we follow those things? So there's that perspective that we have to be mindful of as well. Again, communication and referrals. I would refer folks to other places right now, Illinois, but and communicate what we can do. But safety is our uncompromising priority, as I think it must be for all of us. So enough of that. It's the policies to manage the relationships, because that's for us what it's about. The value is happily and safely hosting folks. But then even before, and this is my last segment before we break off, beyond the policies of the paperwork and bringing people back in, there is the staff safety, because only if we can start bringing staff back and keeping them safe or having them work in a safe environment would we be able to then have the practices to bring outside guests and visitors in safely. So it's our responsibility for those of us who are in positions of ownership or responsibility or stewardship of managing folks. How and when do we welcome them back? As states start loosening or amending shelter in place or lifting those orders, it may not be best to welcome all your staff back at once. You certainly may want something like a re-entry team, and you can discuss, what do we need to put in place? Do we mark down in our hallways where 6 feet is? Have we done the due diligence of seeing how large our staff lounge is, and then marking maybe only 2 or 3 people in there at a time? Beyond our actual staff, some of us, the Cenacle does not have any contracted employees. It's all staff, including 1 live-in staff, and we're attached to a convent with 18 resident sisters. But again, that responsibility goes beyond just who might sign off on the employee handbook. It's the interns or volunteers that come to our grounds or in our buildings. We want to make sure that we've come up with policies that keep them safe, whether it relates to wearing masks or, again, gloves or other equipment that we might need at this time. Of course, managing and the responsibility of employees and best practices, a lot of that is predicated on the fact that we wish to still be here a month from now or 6 months from now. And so we all become a little different of whether we've gotten different aspects of the CARES Act, be that the employer tax credit or the payroll protection program. Whether we were eligible or have those things will kind of dictate what we can do with staff. And so it's not just the policies of physical and personal safety, but it's looking at our mission statement or vision statements and assessing our guiding questions and values, and how do we hold and take care of ourselves and our staff, not just in the physical safety sense, but in the psychological sense, and in the sense of stewardship that relates to budgeting at this time, which many of us are facing difficult decisions if we haven't already. I know many have already issued furloughs and things like that. And then, of course, for those of us who wish and are so happy to welcome social justice organizations into our facilities, it's ensuring that integrity of word and deed, that just as we want to help change and better the world, we're doing that with what we can manage internally. And so, communicating with staff and ensuring that stakeholders who make these decisions understand the realities of, economic impact and class issues and race issues and gender issues and pay, if you're going to amend that. So that's my 3-point, the case study of the Cenacle, an overview of some external policies that we've been dealing with, and certainly what I am looking at with internal policies for both safety and practicality for staff at this time, because we do not have a date of opening at this time. And as I mentioned, we will be closed at least through July 1st. So that's my overview, and I would turn it over to Ben so that you all can get a respite, or your ears at least, from me, and we can go into our breakout rooms, and you can discuss whichever of the two you want to, or both of the practical internal or external policies, and then we'll come back and I'll help facilitate a larger sharing of that information.
Great. I have some breakout rooms prepared, about 5 to 6 people in a room. And we were thinking that we would do this for about 20 minutes because there's a lot to discuss. But if we could have somebody in each room, just jot down some notes so that we have something to share back. that will be helpful. Sometimes it's hard with these breakout groups. All this information comes out that's so valuable, and then it's like disappears into the ether. So if someone could kind of help report back, that would be great. Do we have any other input or questions as we go into these groups? I'm just randomly assigning. Any other thoughts? All right, let's have fun. I'm going to pause the recording.
All right. We're doing all right. It's my group.
You were just hitting the our major consideration is.
The major consideration is the most important thing to share is
have we got folks back from our breakout groups? Are we missing anyone? I think we have folks back.
Speak up if you're missing.
Yeah, do you know someone who was here a moment ago and has now disappeared? Other than Alan? That was a lovely breakout group. I hope yours was as good as mine. I would like to pass it off again to Mark to guide us in kind of some bouncing ideas off of each other. What did we hear? What are we thinking about? What's top of mind right now as we come out of those breakout groups?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I'll follow the format that has usually been done. So we'll go through and I'll call on someone from each of the 5 breakout groups to share the highlights, no lowlights, please, even though it's a rough time, of your group discussion. And then we might have a little more time for an extended point when we see or hear rather what seems most common. So breakout room number 1. Do we have a scribe who's willing to speak? Ben, by chance,
I'll speak for us. We had a variety of conversations about the different types of retreat facilities, the different levels of which we are planning on starting up or having no idea. Concerns regarding food service, size of groups, and how we're going to distance those groups. Looking at policies for deposits and how those are carrying through. The whole interesting fact of some groups requesting space now because some facilities are based on mother houses or where there are other religious communities. They can't be there, so they're looking towards facilities that don't have that elder care on the property. And how soon can you accommodate that and what types of things? So those were the points of discussion. We didn't come to any great answers, but anybody else can feel free to add to that.
Thank you, Sister Sue. I wonder, by a show of hands, I know we might have one person who's not on video right now. How many, as of today, for your center, whether it's tentative or flexible, have a date set from which you're going to reopen? If you have a date set to reopen, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, am I counting 5? Say 5 2/3 maybe. For those of you, for those 5, is there anyone who would be before July 1st? Paul, you're in Indiana, right? Indiana, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a group coming in June 2nd already.
Because Indiana's reopened, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for allowing my interjection. Breakout room 2. A moderator from breakout room 2.
folks may not know their breakout room number. Ben, do you recall who was in which?
I apologize, I did not memorize that.
Hey, listen, I'll say on breakout room 2, but I think I was breakout room 3. But that's okay. I'll fill the void. I'm Jean Richardson from Kirkridge. One of the things that I continue to be amazed about is the diversity of who gathers in these rooms and who we are and what we represent. So we represented the West to the East Coast. We represented centers as big as 260 capacity to 22, and obviously the procedures, the policies that we have in place, are different, and our understanding of who we are different. One person actually, which I thought was a great idea, was started with questions that their staff had, formed them into buckets, and then came up with working groups of how it is that they may approach opening up. So the buckets were health and safety, reading the building, readying the building, readying the community, and stewardship and fiscal responsibility. So I thought that was a really great idea. Clearly things keep, so then the next group, which was much smaller, right now because of PPP still has their kitchen going with bread baking and making bone broth, and yet is very hesitant to get out information to her staff because things keep changing, right? And so it's pondering how to have the sweetness and hospitality of their center continue through all of this, and pondering solo camping retreats with the understanding that people would be very, very strict in how they would be committed to not stopping along the way and how they would enter into the community. From my point of view, I don't think we're going to reopen until spring of next year. I think I have all sorts of questions about what's this, not only the safety of the group, but also safety of staff, and safety of the geographic communities that we live in, and our responsibility about bringing in people from New Jersey and New York into rural Pennsylvania, and what that might do to help spread the virus. But I don't know. We're kind of open, but we certainly haven't set a date yet. And we're a much smaller facility. We've moved a lot of our programming online. Like all of you, I think all of our groups were very generous and understanding in what they have to do regarding return policies and refunds and rebooking. We talked a little bit about hybrid choices, which would be Zoom choices of people, how many people are going to go online, and how many people are going to want to, what one person returned to is venge booking, which is want human contact. And so they're going to, verge booking. So they're really going to want to be together. And so that we're not going to see a downturn, but we're actually going to see an upturn in our work because people crave human contact. And then one of our centers was really curious about what's the balance going to be as we look toward the future of people discovering new ways to communicate and new ways to do retreat online, and how is that going to affect our work as physical plants and physical centers. So I think the biggest thing I took away, and then I'll open it up to the group if they want to say something, but is really the diversity of situations that we are common in our work, but we are not common so much in our settings. And so there are no right or wrong answers to this. There's just possibilities.
Thank you, Jean. And I would echo that. I was talking to Ben a few moments before we got started, and I said how unique this is that retreat centers are such apples to oranges entities. But of course, there are certain values that I think hold us together through our mission and purpose. I'm going to skip to Keith, who I know was going to be the reporter for the group I was in, because that way we can narrow down the last two groups and who can speak. So process of elimination. Keith, if you want to share what was in your group, please.
Sure. So a similar diversity of folks of size of arena. A few notes. There was some conversation around pulling in legal support to figure out how we need to change waivers or include language around your acknowledging that you're putting yourself at a higher risk than you are by staying at home by participating in a retreat. So there was conversation around that. One entity has already reached out to some legal folks to help create updated language. So there was an interest in sharing some of that language. Some commentary about how, what are we asking our staff to do right now? And that given that there's a moving target for when are we reopening, when can we see groups? There's a diversity in what we're asking our staff to do, but certainly a opportunity to think about things from different places. Job descriptions that used to include kind of more clerical things are including program development or, you know, what have you. So lots of conversations around shifting responsibilities there. We too had a brief conversation around deposits and, you know, unsure what to do to carry deposits over. Are they restricted? Are they not? What if your operation might close down? Do you have a legal obligation to do something with those deposits? So there was some little conversation there. And then a conversation around some, I guess I'll call it opt-in language. So staff having some sort of pledge that they might sign that they're agreeing to certain behaviors outside of work so as to decrease the risk of transmission when coming into work. So those were a brief synopsis of the conversations we had. We were group 5.
Thank you, Keith. So if anyone does remember their groups, we've got group 3 or 4. So if we have someone from group 3 or 4, if you'd like to speak, that would be great.
And I'm from group 4. I remembered group 4. I was really just grateful to be with people in a smaller group, understanding some of the same issues. The first thing we said was like bathrooms, and we spent probably the 20 minutes on bathrooms. So our brief notes was really about how agile our plans can be as we are shifting sand. It's all a guess, it felt like. Some of our focus was on how we're communicating that both internally and externally. You know, we're calling people, we're checking in on them, we're being transparent about where we're at. One retreat center shared that they were sending videos to help people feel grounded in their space. We also talked about virtual programs. For some, it wasn't profitable. For some, they took the time to slow down and reimagine. And then others, they jumped right in. And then, of course, we did talk about bathrooms. So one person suggested giving everyone their own bathroom, but that limited them to only have 12 people on site. So are they going to be making a profit, or do they have to fill every weekend, every day to make sure they can do that? And part of that came with the education about safety precautions. And then the last 2 things we spent our time on was, do we survey the groups who are long-term supporters and say, what would ease your mind in coming back? Here's what we're planning. Here are our safety precautions. What else do you need so you can feel safe in coming back? And then finally, one for the RCC at large is, how do we share these best practices when we go back to our own camps? How do we regroup and share?
Thank you, Justine, and group 4. So if you were a part of a group where somebody hasn't shared yet, that means you were in group 3. So if somebody from group 3 would like to clue us all into your conversation, you are welcome to do so now.
I'll start off, and then if folks want to chime in. So we had the whole spectrum in our group. There was one, Villa Maria, who was just welcoming staff back onto their site. Lindenwood, Arlene's center, getting ready, gearing up for a major retreat in early June. And then Highlander with no near-term plans to open, and sort of the retreat team coming togetherness not being core to Highlander's work, or primary, I should say. And so just a few kind of highlights. the folks talked a fair amount about just the, really deep focus on making the space safe for staff, and really sort of the amount of communication, engagement, to make staff feel safe coming back, and not to underestimate that. My sense was that Arlene and her team at Lindenwood have developed a whole set of new protocols as they gear up to have a 60-person retreat in early June that folks could really learn from, and maybe even take and reuse in some of their centers, in terms of really a lot around the sort of communication tools that signal to guests that things have been well cleaned and are safe, and there's clear protocols in place for how to keep distance while still creating a welcoming environment. And then I think really it could be some interesting learning to dig more into from Highlander, moving their work out into community, and being in, sort of being in community during the work, doing the work, rather than needing to be on site, bringing people together. There also were some legal questions that came up in our group, with one center being asked to include a pandemic clause in their reservation. So just to kind of connect the legal theme. But from our group that want to chime in? Okay.
Well, thank you. We've got a few minutes, so I'm going to steer us to a couple things. A couple other things I do also just want to share before we get to a couple questions I have that anyone can chime in on. One is I forgot to disclose, though I said it in the breakout group, March 17th, a few days after we closed at the Cenacle, marked 100 years since the sisters opened their retreat center on our site. So it's been an interesting 100th anniversary thus far. But what Diana just said about being welcoming, one thing that ties in, I think, internal and external, my bifurcation there of policies and procedures is, I know we're not in the hotel industry. In fact, we at the Cenacle fought the state of Illinois over that a couple of years ago, as some other retreat centers may have as well. But I am reading what hotels are doing in addition to talking with other retreat center directors and ensuring guests feel safe and are they hosting. So Crystal and I have been calling hotels in the Chicago area because even when other regions of Illinois might progress in phases, we think Chicago is going to be the last to open up to allow us to have 10 people, which is the next phase, and then groups of 50 people, and then there's no limit. That's what the governor of Illinois has outlined. And one of my big concerns, other than bathrooms, we didn't talk about in our group, but that's one item, and how we serve food is, how do we welcome and check out people, especially for those of us that might host groups of 20 or more. And I hear hotels talk about contactless check-in, which I don't know is really possible with our setup, and the 6 feet and all of that. So I just wonder, when it comes to perhaps amending policies, has anyone discussed or developed or is willing to share thoughts on safe guest check-in, especially if they're receiving keys or something like that?
Oh, this is Pam. I'm University of St. Mary of the Lake, and I can tell you what we've started. And again, wishing we had a platform that we could do virtually, like, on your phone, like a hotel. We don't. So what we're doing is, what we're as we're developing, because we're underneath, like Mark, we're in Mundelein, Illinois, which is close to the Wisconsin border in Illinois. We are suggesting putting the keys, because we still have physical keys, in the guest's room and assigning rooms in advance, and then working with the point of contact for the the organizer of the retreat to submit a rooming list to us. When they give us the rooming list, we will send back what room's been assigned along with a map of the floor plan, and then have like a welcome letter and so on. So the guests would come to the retreat center, go into their room. There would be a little welcome packet there with their key. The door would be unlocked, of course, and then they would call the front desk to confirm that they got into the space, and then go through any other questions and stuff with the front desk. So that's what we're preliminary discussing. we haven't implemented it, but that's one of the ideas on the table.
Thank you.
I recognize that I might be unpopular in the way I'm about to say this, but I think it's an important note. I think we are doing ourselves a disservice if we think that we are figuring out the ways to make a guest feel safe or think we've done the appropriate amount of cleaning. We are going to have COVID-19 in our spaces. Every restaurant right now is doing all of the things that they can to sanitize, and their workers go home or go to the grocery store or go somewhere else and are going to encounter COVID-19. And so until we have gotten to a point of vaccination or a point of treatment, we're talking about this like we can avoid it. And I don't think that's plausible. And I don't think it's healthy for us to have the conversation in that way. So I think if we're reopening, I was thinking about the comment in our small group about like, what is our staff agreeing to try to do at home? If we're reopening, we need to acknowledge we're putting COVID-19 in our spaces. So I just want to note that as something, not that we don't clean, but we cleaned before. Not that we don't think about how to be sanitary, but we thought about how to be sanitary before. So I just want to note that, somewhat stark, but I think if we pivot and say, it will be in our space, how are we going to address it when it is a different conversation than how do we avoid COVID-19 in our spaces.
I think, Keith, thank you for bringing that up. I think it's just the reality of the pandemic, isn't it? I mean, at one point, you get excited that you did a virtual program and were able to touch folks, and you want to get excited about that, and then it hits you like, oh, this is not normal. Or you want to reopen, yet, oh, we got COVID. You know, it's the constant dual sense that we're in, this tension that I think we're all in. So thank you for bringing that perspective.
I agree.
I'm sorry, sister, go ahead.
That's okay. The other thing my staff talked about this morning is, given, you welcome a group, no matter how big it is, you're not going to intrude into their meetings or whatever. And so we may have protocols in place, like you must wear a mask, you must social distance. But if they choose not to follow those, the enforcement part of it on us becomes very, very difficult and almost impossible. It's the same thing that the states that have opened up are facing in terms of how do you enforce what still is in place, but people are choosing not to. So when we welcome people into our space, there's that risk that we're taking. And so what will that mean to us? I don't have the answer.
Sorry to have been a buzzkill, everyone.
Yeah. I really hear what you're saying, Keith, and I mean, I prayerfully worry about folks who are opening up this soon. I've come from both a congregational ministry context in which my spouse is a priest who's having these conversations about the danger of bringing her aging congregation into a sanctuary and having to ask the question, where does the sanctuary exist? Where does it really exist? And I think that, if it's one thing. I mean, I think that there's another way to look at it too, which I really respect, which is, there's beyond the bottom line or triple bottom line, but the question of where can people gather if they need to find refuge, and how do we pivot toward creating sanctuary in that sense for people and refuge for people, and how that becomes a driving component and dimension to how we adapt protocols. But as I'm hearing and glancing to the congregational world and different traditions, and then now on this retreat call, I'm very worried for people on this call. In addition to the guests that we would be bringing against maybe their own I mean, it's like, I'm not trying to condescend against who people are and their own free will and their own choice, et cetera, but it is a question about the leadership that our spaces can offer, and maybe we need to offer more deliberately and directly, and be in conversation with our different polities and our different different central bodies that dictate and govern how we earn revenue and stuff like that. But it's like, it's really freaky. Like, I live in a rural county that, right when the state started to open up is when the community spread started to happen, right? So I'm not really convinced that we're in a moment where we can prepare all the liability we want, and but in the same way that we can't control the liability that's associated with driving back and forth between our retreat centers, we're not going to be able to, it's not that is a bit apples and oranges. It's not a clear parallel, but I'm just concerned about these things. So I'm more interested in the way that policy means more than liability, and like it means our relationships. I really appreciated the way that Mark talked about it. Is like, how does our policy really reflect the way that we govern our relationships? And that this is a moment to really expand the concept of policy and to shift about how people gather.
This is Brooke at Watershed, and I actually really appreciate all these statements. And I've shared a few times, I think, on this call that I found out that I am high risk, and I know many of us are on this call. And at the same time, I've been playing with the idea and am ready to move on it. And I would really love you all to tell me that I'm nuts. Out doing solo tent-based retreats for frontline workers and organizers, but essentially where people would come up, they'd be in a 10 by 10 tent that we've sort of styled out, and that we can then just place in the sun for a bunch of days after they leave before we clean, but not having them come into any buildings or come into any proximity with any of our staff, though we would be out only for the summer months, so that we can maintain a sense of who we are, even though these would be very different. There'd be no group activities. I don't know that people would be able to go in our lake, but I certainly don't want people, I do not want to endanger our staff is a no-go for me, and endangering people by putting them in spaces that are not clean and safe. I have been thinking about like wipe down plastic tables and things that they themselves can pull out into the sun, and or inviting people to bring their own gear up, where they just come up with their gear and then they leave, which it feels like it would prohibit folks based on class or access to those kinds of things. But I'm curious whether I certainly don't need to move on this, but it is like, oh shit, July, August, September, we could actually do something that potentially could be a safe alternative and make use of our space. So given that, with lots of details that I'm happy to share ad nauseum with anybody who's interested in talking about this with me, I'd love to have you all tell me that this is either a great idea or totally unworkable.
If I could just really quickly, Brooke, I think you're very courageous. I don't think it's, and so in that, I mean, without knowing details, how do we respond? But to see that you're a person who are trying to make some sort of response, right? And so I think that's what you're trying to do. I wonder if there's an invitation there for us as retreat centers, as Keith brought up this issue or this perspective of those of you who are going to go and take that next step, is how do we follow you? How do we support you? How do we find some way to connect with you as you go through this experience? Because yeah, it's such the tension we ride on, I think. I just throw that as an invitation. How do we follow? How do we support? How do we make that connection? Or how do we tell you, don't do it?
I would be interested, Paul, I know you raised your hand, someone else did, for folks who are opening sooner. Do you and your boards have the sense that you're opening because things are okay? Or is it we're opening because our state is opening and we need to from a business standpoint, and we acknowledge that COVID-19 will be present in our spaces?
I think it's one, we're opening because the state is opening. We're opening because the sisters and the location of our retreat center is somewhat, it's separate from where the sisters all live, and dining is separate, and so they can be contained in a particular area, so that, again, in terms of, you know, if it's spread, it'll be in that one particular area, and we can kind of manage and maintain it from there. I don't know, Paul, what do you?
Well, and we were both the two that had our hands raised. It's the same place, though, that is opening. And I think we're doing it with a group that has been together doing a training for a number of years so far. And it's a small group, and so it gives us a chance to observe and to kind of walk those steps of what would be the issues, and hopefully be able to share some with, I mean, we have them in our very largest room for 8 people, and they're in a circle that it could be probably more like 20 feet apart. This room is so large that it will kind of give us an idea of how things work, and, you know, and I guess we're trying to be hospitable in the fact that this group truly wants to come, and as it's gone up the chain, it's kind of, yeah, this is going to happen. And so I'm going to be the only one on staff in the building with them. Out of 5 on staff, they're all staying away. So they know who their one contact is, and we can keep social distance. And usually there's a one contact person. You guys talked about keys, and that our keys are already in the rooms, and they are actually sanitized, and everything is part of the cleaning process. And that trying to get, we took all the binders that have paper in them out of the rooms, that, you know, kind of like a lot of hotels have those binders. We had something similar. Found out, we went through and go, this, we don't even really need this in there. And so I pulled all the binders last week, got them out of there already. So trying to think through things and trying to walk slowly through it. You know, we have a lot more that have canceled even in June and July and August, October, that there are very few that want to still meet, but there are still some that want to come together. So I don't know if that answers your question well, but.
I appreciate the answer.
I think, Paul, the point you're bringing up is that we can't create a blanket policy statement across retreat centers, across communities that we work with, across municipalities, across states, because each has different factors, different infection rates, and different standards. You know, it's different if we're opening up Commonweal for a summer camp with 17-year-olds versus a retreat for people with cancer, versus a meditation group that's been meeting on a regular basis for the last 3 months together in the same room in San Francisco. So it's trying to figure out these permutations that has led us to mostly cancel it, just not to assume the risk, because it's hard to judge based on what people tell us what the reality is. And there's a reputation thing. If Commonweal had a reputation that it was a hotbed for virus infection, even though we did everything and it wasn't at our fault, we're not going to be able to hold a retreat here for people with cancer for at least a year or 2. Because that reputation is just going to stick to us, and it would not feel safe for people. And people have choices whether they come to retreat centers. So that's the factor that comes in as well. Though maybe if we did a summer camp, it might shift how we frame the conversation. But these are, I could understand either way. I know Jennifer and I have had many conversations about what is reasonable, what are standards that are acceptable. At the moment, our county doesn't allow more than 10 people to gather, so it's a moot point. But that might be released within 2 weeks. We'll see.
Then another question attendant to what's been brought up, which I find it a relief to talk about, Keith. Thank you. To really look at the realities of the downside of all this. One of the obvious next questions is that if people come, and they will, as you say, with COVID and get it, then we have a whole series of dominoes that fall about how we then take care of the site, who's been exposed, who's quarantined, who on staff, all of those pieces that are obvious and will vary, but the step after infection on one of our sites is a whole host of ramifications as well to really consider deeply. And it's hard to wrap the mind around this when we're so used to warm hospitality. And the shift in consciousness that's going to be required of all of us is enormous and is already happening. So that, as Alan said, we can provide sanctuary and refuge some way deeply in light of these liabilities and concerns. Huge and important question.
Yeah, Jennifer, thank you for that. I just want to be mindful of the time. We have about 8 minutes left. And I think this conversation could go on for days, and it will look different every day. And so one of the last kind of prompts we can talk about is how do we continue this conversation, and how can the RCC support everyone, those who are opening up in a couple weeks and those who are going to be learning through the summer months into the fall. What would you all like to see next in this conversation?
This is Joanne. My picture isn't on the screen, and I apologize for that. This is just a general attitude that I would hope that we would ascribe to, and that is that whenever any of us decide to open, and whenever COVID, someone comes with COVID or develops COVID while they're at our center, that we would be willing to be really transparent with each other about that and not take it as a failure or a point of shame, but as somebody said a few calls ago, we all have different levels of risk tolerance and different risk factors. And I just think if we could be really honest with each other and see all of this as an experience for learning, that would be really helpful.
Thanks, John, for saying that. Absolutely. This is a learning process that I think someone earlier mentioned the magic ball we don't have, right? We don't have the answers.
Right. Thanks.
This is it. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
This is Ning, real quickly. Sorry, it's coming up at the top of the hour, but we actually at OAEC had a situation that actually happened in early March. So whenever that time is right, as we unfold, I mean, there's being proactive in looking at what are steps moving forward, but then there's also lessons learned, because situations will happen in real time, and those are, you know, I think, at least for OAEC, because we've gone through round one, it's helping us think through, like, when we open, which we're not opening anytime soon, what are the things in play?
This is just an idea to plant a seed, but I imagine most retreat centers have had some sort of encounter in their time with bed bugs. Follow my logic for a moment here. We acknowledge as directors that this is an issue. We know that companies make all sorts of protectors for mattresses. We know that we can call someone to spray. We know sometimes preventative measures are helpful, but we still might get a case that it can spread to our own homes. And yet we don't approach it in a way that says, hi, all constituents, you are now at risk of bed bugs because you're coming to our retreat center. So I think there is something that we can learn from having to deal with that might be helpful in how we approach this. Not saying they're the same, one's deadly, one's not, totally get that, but there's something that we can learn there if we dive in, I think.
Well, I think we brought bed bugs up a couple of weeks ago, so that seems to be a thread.
Well, that's definitely one of those places where don't feel shameful. it happens, and you could not have them today and have them tomorrow, and it's of no fault of anyone's, and just deal with it as best you can. So.
Justine, you asked what could help as we move forward, depending on where we are in the process. For me, it would be helpful for me if those who are developing, like, if somebody talked about waivers that people might sign if they do come back. So some of those new things that we would not have had in place because these things were not in, these things weren't happening. Sharing some of those, if anybody was willing, would be very helpful to me. I don't know how anybody else would see that, but I would appreciate that.
To follow up on Jane Marie, I think, yeah, absolutely. If folks have waivers or pledges or other things that they've already developed and they want to share it with the rest of the group so that we can develop our own from that, I can serve as point person for that. And I already have in some ways. So I have some of the stuff that Arlene is developing with the little cards that hang on the door that say we've cleaned it in such and such a way, and some of the other materials from different states' guidelines, some of the materials that Mark talked about. So if there's other materials that you have and you want to share, or if you have a question for me, if you're looking for a specific item, I can act as point person. We also have some Google Drive links that I can share too. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Ben, that's wonderful. Thank you. I think to respect our time, if there are more questions or other ways you would like to see information shared, please let Ben know. This is a work in progress as always. And I just want to thank Mark for the lovely facilitation, so much wealth of knowledge you shared with us at the beginning, and grateful to all the breakout spaces. There were so many new faces on this call today. How wonderful. We hope you come back and in the meantime ask questions and start building connections. It was just lovely to see new folks join. If you have feedback, please again email Ben. He's getting all of the emails, and then we'll send it on to the right person, or he's probably the right person for it. So please ask him questions. And just a reminder, there were scheduled calls. Next call is a more heart-centered call with Teresa Mateus on a healing and grounding circle. So next Tuesday at the same time. So we hope you can join that. I believe her title is called Holding the Heaviness of the Moment, which we so need. And also we need these conversations, so balancing that. Thank you all for your time today, and we hope you are well.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
Great to see you all. Take care.
You too.
Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Hi, sorry, I'm just taking notes from the chat.
I was just gonna copy the whole thing. So if you've got it, that's great.
I have the questions. There's 48 private messages.
My chat is insane on this call. I don't know why. So much chatting.
So much chatting. Oh yeah. Oh, we're still recording.
Okay. Well, wonderful. It's been fun. Goodbye, everyone.
Good.